On August 29, 2013, the UK Parliament voted on whether or not to intervene militarily in Syria. Israel's helpers in the UK Parliament pushed for the UK to prioritise the national interests of Israel over those of the UK and vote for an attack on Israel's archenemy. President Assad was compared to Hitler and pro-peace advocates to appeasers of Hitler by such Zionists.
I will give way.
If he is talking about Hitler's use of gas on soldiers, he should not forget that Hitler in fact did use poison gas on innocent civilians, 6 million Jews to be precise.
I'm delighted to have the extra minute, especially as that was the very next point I was going to make. Given it must be said that a large proportion of members of my family were amongst those victims who were gassed. And the reason that Hitler did use poison gas against those innocent victims was because he didn't give a fig for the gas protocol. What he cared about was whether or not people could hit back.
But pressure from the British public, who didn't want to get dragged into another war for Israel, led many MPs to vote against the war. Members of the US Congress are more easily co-opted by pro-Israel lobbyists, who want Israel's enemies such as Syria to be balkanized, as stated in the Oded Yinon plan. Unlike the US Congress, the UK Parliament still appears to have some politicians who are not agents of the emerging Israeli empire.
The very first line of the statement says that this House deplores the use of chemical weapons in Syria on the 21st of August 2013 by the Assad regime, which caused hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries of Syrian civilians. We've gone from an assumption to an actual declaration that we know that Assad did this. I couldn't support that under any circumstances, because I believe in some form of due process which identifies who is the perpetrator.
If you are going to commit us to this sort of action again, you must do it on the very, very best evidence available. What we've heard today has shown we do not have that evidence. We don't have the certainty that it needs.
I do not believe it is wise to entirely rule out the possibility that the chemical weapons could have been wielded by Assad's opponent. The question you always have to ask in these circumstances, cui bono, who benefits? His opponents know that only chemical weapons would trigger a reluctant President Obama to authorise a military intervention. And a military strike, whatever the Prime Minister says, would inevitably tilt the scales in the civil war in favour of Assad's opponents. We've heard earlier that the UN investigator Con-Dem Coalition said in May, and I quote, "According to testimonies we have gathered, the rebels have used chemical weapons, making use of sarin gas. They did it in May, they may have done it again."
We have an evil dictator, but the opposition to that evil dictator is even worse. These are people who will oppose the West at all costs and will of course cause damage not only to their own people. They are barbaric, they are inhuman, and we should not support them in any shape or form. So I would not support any regime change or attempt to regime change.
Israel used white phosphorus in its attack in Gaza, in Operation Cast Lead, and I saw the consequences for myself when I went there. But Israel gets away with it because it's on the right side of what is regarded as civilized opinion. There is selectivity right the way through. We're told that we're being bundled into this situation because of President Obama. The President Obama who sends a stream of drones over Pakistan, violating its sovereignty and murdering its citizens.
My colleagues in my party and myself, we believe that any military action would prolong the conflict and lead to further bloodshed.
Or it could have been done by the Syrian rebels with the direct aim of dragging the West into the war. These are the only, no, not for the moment. These are the only people who actually have a clear motive that fits this crime. Now, JIC sort of discounted that, but there are many reasons for us to worry about this concern. We do not want to be conned into a war, in effect, by actions designed just to do that. And there are plenty of facts around, or facts, or at least reported facts, reported that the UN representative for human rights for Syria thought there was concrete evidence of rebels having sarin gas. Reports that the Turkish authorities arrested 12 al-Nusra fighters with 2 kilograms of sarin gas. Other reports that Hezbollah fighters are in Beirut hospitals suffering from the effects of sarin gas. Now, I think a number of people, most notably my honourable friend, right honourable friend, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, said we must have clear evidence to show this House that if there is a casus belli, it's real, not confected, not constructed.
But while I'm pleased that the government's resolution now accepts that we must wait for the inspectors' reports, I am deeply concerned at its cavalier treatment of international law, and I completely reject its drive towards military action. On the legal question, both the US and our government are indicating that they are prepared to act against Syria without a UN mandate. For all that the government's motion talks of making every effort to ensure a Security Council resolution, the bottom line appears to be that they're happy to proceed without one. Now, we are told that intervention could be legally justified without a Security Council resolution under the UN's responsibility to protect. But the 2005 UN World Summit outcome document, in which the heads of state unanimously approved the new international norm of the responsibility to protect, subsequently approved by UN Security Council 1674, states very clearly that it is still subject to UN Security Council agreement.
But there is no case in international law for this military attack. Neither a UN Security Council resolution authorising it, nor Article 51 of the UN Charter, which permits a right of self-defence, but that clearly doesn't apply to a chemical gas attack in eastern Damascus, which is obviously not an attack on another state.
But we have had information before when, in fact, there was poison gas used, and it was told by the Carla Del Ponte, who was the UN Commissioner in Syria, who actually pointed out that it was the rebels had used it. So I just wondered, I really would like whoever is winding up, or the Deputy Prime Minister, to say to me, what happens if despite what everyone thinks, what happens if they actually come back and they discover that it's been the rebels have used the chemical weapons last week, or some general, rogue general? Will the Prime Minister then be saying the things he did about the use of chemical weapons?
It draws you into agreement, but there is a sting in the tail, and the sting in the tail is that it asks us to agree that that unilateral Western military action is legally justified. I do not agree with that statement, and for that reason I'm sorry that I will not be supporting the government motion tonight.
And I would at this point refer to yesterday's Guardian, where Hans Blake said that even if Assad used chemical weapons, the West has no mandate to act as a global policeman and by ordering airstrikes against Syria without a UN Security Council mandate. President Obama would therefore be doing the same as Bush in 2003.
I will not vote for war. I will never vote for war against Syria. If there is a second vote, I will vote against it, definitely. I do not believe there ever will be a second vote, because I do not believe the parliamentary arithmetic stacks up. And the parliamentary arithmetic doesn't stack up because MPs are doing their job. They are listening to what the public want. And the voice of the public is completely clear. They do not want war. They are scarred by what went on in Iraq. We were lied to in Parliament, and we are not going to go down that route again. I voted against the Iraq war. I will vote against this war. What would it achieve? That's what we've got to ask ourselves. What would it achieve? Why is it any of our business? Has Syria ever been a colony? Has it ever been in our sphere of interest? Has Syria ever posed the single remotest threat to the British people? Our job in this Parliament is to look after our own people. Our own economy is not in a very good shape, nor our social services, yes, nor our schools and hospitals. It's our job to think about the problems are here. And if I'm told that we're burying our heads in the sand, are there anguished debates in other parliaments all over Europe about whether we should bomb Syria? No. They're getting on with running their own countries, and so should we. Yes, I will give way.
Would you agree with me that if we were to punish every appalling regime, because punish is the word that seems to spring to mind, by dropping missiles on them, that missiles will be crisscrossing the skies on a daily basis?
Absolutely. And although we've spoken with great moral certitude in this debate, the fact is that our contribution to such an attack on Syria would be infinitesimal. Have we not degraded our own armed forces in the last 3 years, contrary to warnings repeatedly made by myself and others? Do we have an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean at this point? So, in reality, we would simply be hanging on the coattails of President Obama. He was foolish enough to issue a red line. His credibility is on the line, not the credibility of the British people or ourselves. We don't have to follow him in this foolish gesture. We know that we cannot destroy the chemical stocks of President Assad. We know that we can only degrade them. We know that there is not any significant group actually in Syria which would praise us to any degree, apart from these famous rebels, which we have been supporting over the last 2 years. Who are these rebels? Do we in the West seriously actually want Assad to lose power? Do we want him to be replaced by a regime which includes Sunni jihadists? That is why actually we have over the years been buttressing what has been a stable regime. I will give way in a moment. It's simply not in our national interest to bomb Syria. It would not degrade his chemical stocks. It would actually result in a grave, I think it would actually result in more pressure being placed on minorities in Syria. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend, and I'm listening very carefully to what he is saying. I think he's making some very powerful points. And I wonder if he's aware of the comments of Sir Andrew Green, who currently is the chairman of Migration Watch, but is also the former very respected ambassador to Damascus, who has said in the last couple of days that if the regime were to fall, that chaos would follow, because the kind jihadists to whom my own friend has made reference, they would take control, and that would be hugely not in the interest of the United Kingdom.
Absolutely. We've heard very little about actually what is going on the ground in Syria. How many people who've been speaking with such great moral certainty today have actually visited Syria? I must confess I've only been there once. It seemed to be a pretty, as far as I could see, the minorities were protected. The Christians, 2 million of them, are protected by Assad. What's going to be their fate when Assad falls? What's going to be the fate of the 2 million Alawites? What's going to be the fate of the 22 other minorities? How much do we know in this House about what's actually going on in Syria? Yet we believe that we have the moral right, we who know so little about the complexities of this situation, we believe that we have the moral right to commit execution on people, because that's what we're talking about. You can't send cruise missiles onto a country without killing people, and that's what we would be doing. What right have we to say in this House that we know actually what went on with any certainty on that date? What right have we to say that we can sort this situation out? No, there is a better way. It's a way of peace. It's a way of diplomacy, and not, Mr. Speaker, of war. And therefore, I cannot support this motion tonight. I will give some certain credit to the Prime Minister, but I will not vote for it tonight.
Pat McFadden.
But the question is, will bombing, no matter how strategic, how precise, how short, will make things, if not better for the Syrian people, at least not worse? And I believe that it won't. And I have yet to be persuaded by anyone who has spoken in this debate that this would make things better for the Syrian people. I also...
And the broken stones that were left there when the chamber was rebuilt, to remind us that we have the power of life and death over our citizens. And I think the debate today is a prime example of the decisions we all have to make, which could result in life or death, not just for our citizens, but for others. However, I have to say, having listened to the debate very carefully all day today, I still feel that I do not have enough accurate or verifiable information to support direct UK military action in Syria.
And let us not forget, we've been here before in the Iraq debacle about international inspectors and the works that they'd done. It was clouded as to whether they could carry on or not. The reality here is that if we were to, I think, unleash a strike on Syria, then that would not just hamper them, but again, the credibility of the UN would be at stake. So I hope that issues do become clearer over the next few days and months. And in the words of Ban Ki-moon, we must give them, the United Nations inspectors and peace, a chance, because there are other routes that we could be going down now.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and further to that point, does he also see the implications that there are for the ethnic minorities in Syria, the Christian ones in particular, who have been subjected to ethnic cleansing over a period of time? Those Christians, they just want to have, in their opinion, support the Syrian state and the country's unity, but yet no, they're subject to intimidation or persecution.
Well, indeed, and other right honourable and honourable members have made reference, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the religious minorities in Syria and the impact this conflict is having upon them. And we've had some very colourful and dreadful descriptions of what's happening in Syria. And I think in terms of the steps that we take next.
It makes no sense whatsoever for the West to have made great play of getting the UN inspectors in to visit the site and inspect the site, only then to have a vote in this House without having actually had the report back from the weapons inspectors to determine the evidence as it is on the ground. So perhaps, Madam Deputy Speaker, the rationale for this debate has moved on somewhat, welcome though that is, but it gives us also an opportunity to raise some questions of the government, because I, for one, remain unconvinced by the arguments I've heard this evening for military action.
But we normally seek cui bono. Who benefits from this? And no one's given a really plausible explanation why, with United Nations investigators in Baghdad, that the Assad regime would want to let off there and then.
It's absolutely clear that we're being driven by a timetable that has no basis of anything other than appeasing the fact that the President of America said last year a red line has been drawn, that red line has been crossed. We saw this 10 years ago when we were driven by a deadline for an American President, which was a deadline for him to get re-elected in 2004. We were wrong to follow him then, we were wrong to follow him now.
So many of us have a reluctance over matters involving peace and war, because we sat here and listened to a Prime Minister at that dispatch box tell us something which I believe now to have been a fabric of lies. And I cannot sit in this House and be duped again by any other Prime Minister, whether it is of my own party or of the party that sits opposite.
Thank God, Mr. Speaker, for the erudition and historical memory of the last three speeches. Almost entirely absent in the Prime Minister's initial address. He was clearly making a speech which was not the one he intended to make here this afternoon. Otherwise, he would not have persuaded you at vast public expense to recall the House of Commons to decide that we're actually going to decide on this matter next week or the week after, when we're back here in any case. It's absolutely evident that if it were not for the democratic revolt which has been underway in this House of Commons and outside in the wider public against this war, that the engines in Cyprus would now be revving and the cruise missiles ready to fly this very weekend. And any attempt by the Prime Minister to pretend that he had always, all along, intended on this course of action is just bunkum. And the reason for the unease here on both sides of the House, two exceptional speeches from the last speaker and the member from New Forest East, encompass the feelings of the people in the country. Only 11% of the public, according to the Daily Telegraph this morning, support Britain becoming involved in a war in Syria. Can ever a British government have imagined sending its men and women to war with the support of just 11% in public opinion? First, that there is no compelling evidence, to use the leader of the opposition's words, that the Assad regime is responsible for this crime yet. Not that they're not bad enough to do it, Mr. Speaker. Everybody knows they're bad enough to do it. The question is, are they mad enough to do it? To launch a chemical weapons attack in Damascus on the very day that a United Nations chemical weapons inspection team arrives in Damascus must be a new definition of madness. And of course, if he is that mad, how mad is he going to be once we've launched a blizzard of Tomahawk cruise missiles upon his country? Now, as I heard the front benches describe how bad he was, I wondered just why the former Prime Minister forced Her Majesty to billet him in her guest room at Buckingham Palace just a few years ago, and how a former Prime Minister recommended him for an honour, and how he was hailed in all corners as a moderniser. But of course the narrative has changed, because the government is intent on regime change in Damascus. Which brings me to the only other point I'm going to be able to make in the time available. The reason for the unease is that people can see the character of the Syrian opposition. They have seen the videos. We've heard about horrific videos. Take a look at the video of one of the commanders of the Syrian revolution cutting open the chest of a human being and eating his heart and liver and videotaping himself and putting it up on YouTube because he thought it might be considered attractive. Take a look at the videos of Christian priests having their heads sawn off, not chopped off, sawn off with bread knives. Even a bishop in the Christian church was murdered by these people. Every religious minority in Syria, and there are 23 of those, is petrified at the victory of the Syrian rebels that the British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary have been doing their utmost to supply with weapons and money these last 2 years, and they cannot deny it. They say it's now about this crime, whoever committed it. But it's been the government's policy for 2 years to bring about the defeat of the regime in Damascus and the victory of the kind of people responsible for these crimes. I have 20 seconds left. Willingly.
If only for another 60 seconds. Remember, the honourable member had made reference, but let's remember where those arms have come from over decades from this country supplied to Syria.
Indeed, indeed. I have now 60 seconds at my disposal, so let me make this point more clearly. When did Russia and China, 2.5 billion people, cease to be members of the international community? Who are you on the other side to decide what the international community thinks should do? If you are unable to persuade the Security Council to go along with your point of view, who are you to decide that you will launch a war in any case? You see, I keep hearing about the unreasonable use of the veto. I've heard that many times over the last few years in this House. The United States has vetoed every attempt to obtain justice for the Palestinian people and to punish and issue retribution for international lawbreaking on the part of Israel, and nobody in this House has said one word about it. Yes, I'll give way.
I'm very grateful for the honourable member for giving way to me. Mr. Speaker, I think you would be very interested to know that I had several constituents email me about comments made by the honourable member for Bradford West on Iranian Press TV, in which my constituent claims that the honourable member said that Israel supplied the chemical
record for the attacks in Syria. I would find that very hard to believe that the honourable member said that. So would he like to take this opportunity to refute that or provide the evidence to satisfy my constituent?
Well, it just shows the unreliability of relying upon green ink letters, whether they come in the post or in emails. For I said no such thing. But the Syrian rebels definitely had sarin gas because they were caught with it by the Turkish government, as was referred to by the former government minister opposite. If he'll forgive me, I forget his constituents say. The truth is this. I know mine, it's where I gave you such a bloody good hiding just over a year ago. The Syrian rebels have got plenty of access to sarin. It's not rocket science, Mr. Speaker. A group of Shinto obscurantists in Japan living on Mount Fuji poisoned the Tokyo underground with sarin gas less than 20 years ago. You don't have to be Einstein to have your hands on sarin gas or the means to distribute it. Russia and China say no to war. So do I and most people in this country.
If not, what on earth are we doing arming all these nations to the teeth? It is time for the Arab League to step up to the plate and for Western countries to recognise that we cannot continue to impose solutions, because those solutions fuel resentment and they harden attitudes. They raise the question about the double standards of the West across the Middle East. Where was the world's policeman in 1985 when Iran was under sustained attack from chemical weapons? It suited the West to be supporting Iraq in that situation. Why did we allow the world's policeman to weaponise white phosphorus? White phosphorus, when it contacts the skin and burns as it oxidises, burns right down to the bone. If that's not a chemical weapon, what is?
At the moment, this House has endorsed the principle of direct peace talks between the Palestinians and the Israeli government. What do we think would the reaction be if we have action against Syria and then Syrian reaction against both Britain and potentially other countries in the region? It would destabilise those talks and probably end the chances of peace in the Middle East forever.
The course of Tony Blair haunts this debate, but much more so the course of Hans Blick haunts this debate. We should have listened to him in 2003. We should have given him time. We should have waited. The one independent voice in the whole arena we ignored. We shouldn't do that again. We should be very, very clear what we're doing tonight. And what we're doing tonight is giving nothing more than a remit to the government to go forward, improve what's happening now. We are not giving a green light for any military action whatsoever.
This was a French colony. We are British, and we ought to reject the concept that we've already tried the regime and that we're therefore pushing to war. And I want my constituents to know the reason why I cannot support such a motion predicated on such a thought.
At the very least, the doctrine of humanitarian intervention has a tenuous basis in current international law, and this renders NATO action legally questionable. So those people who want to rest the argument for a Syrian war on the Kosovan precedent need to read their law again.
And what I think President Obama has done is got the West Wing series out. Look what President Bartlett would do under the circumstances. There is exactly that episode. If we bomb Damascus airport, we're going to kill thousands of people, but they'll never do it again. And of course, the experts say if you do that, the whole world will be against you. And he said, well, what do we do? Well, you bomb a few buildings which have been emptied because everybody knows which buildings are going to be bombed. And the President says that has no effect. And the experts say to him, yes, but that is actually what you have to do. You have to have a response. Now, that may be how it works in America. It doesn't work like that here.
And that's why the Prime Minister switched today to quoting long-standing international conventions prohibiting the use of chemical weapons. However, there is nothing in these conventions that inherently allows other nations to take military action against such a state just because it has used chemical weapons. Certainly not without wider international sanction.
You are not going to actually go anywhere in terms of resolving the problem for the Syrian people unless and until you do grapple differently with this question of those terribly difficult Chinese people and them nasty Ruskies. Well, you have to incentivize the Russians to be involved in a process that actually caters for some of their needs.
We know, the polls tell us, that the public is overwhelmingly against such a military strike. The British public does not want to be drawn into yet another war in the Middle East. The British public have seen that movie and they know how it ends.
There's only one thing which is absolutely guaranteed. Nobody knows what's going to happen if we go down the road of military action. We've seen it too often in recent decades. And in that instance, the fact that we do not have an exit strategy creates the difficulty I have. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have problems, for the Honourable Gentleman's information, both with the government motion and the opposition amendment. I do not believe either is ultimately able to achieve the honourable ends that both sides of this House are trying to achieve. I'm opposed to military intervention in Syria, full stop. And to be honest with myself, and to be consistent on both questions, I will be voting in the no lobby against the government motion and against the opposition amendment.
But I have to say to the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I have not yet heard today a compelling argument to convince me that military intervention in this case is necessary or in our national interest.
But I believe that we have to always reflect on what is our national interest when it is a difficult decision. And I do not believe that our national interest will be served by military intervention in Syria. And I do not believe that this is the way forward for this Parliament. And the idea that we're going to rush in and come back again, perhaps in a few days, just because America is pulling the shots. And I wonder what will happen. What will the Prime Minister say if over the weekend America decides to go it alone?
But his comments reminded me very much indeed of what was said in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq by the USA and Britain. We were told at the time the Saddam Hussein regime had weapons of mass destruction. We were told that the weapons inspectors would not find any because they've been very well hidden. We were told that there was incontrovertible evidence from the intelligence services that weapons of mass destruction existed. And finally, in the last debate in this chamber, we were told that the WMDs could hit this country within 45 minutes. And what happened subsequently? We found out that what was said was not true. The intelligence had been sexed up, the weapons of mass destruction did not exist, and political decisions had been taken at President Bush's ranch in America way before the conflict began.